this way.
Thank you, Jean. One of the hardships of this pandemic is that time feels like it's lost any structure. It's become so hard to predict what will happen next that we seem to be stuck in this kind of aimless time. And so, as one of you put it this week, what we yearn for most is the ability to make plans for the future. So instead of making each week at church a bunch of unpredictable Bible readings, I thought for the month of February, we could add some structure. So I've chosen for us to read and hear about the story of Joseph and his brothers for the entire month of February. You heard Jean starting the story where Joseph is kidnapped by his brothers and introduced into slavery. And over the next coming weeks, we'll hear more about this story, which I think many of you know very well. In the passage we heard today, Joseph's brothers argue over how they should betray their brother. They all resent him for being their father's favorite and having that amazing coat, and for these dreams that he's been telling them about, where he predicts that he will be the one who rules over them all, that they'll all bow down to him. So there's no question in their minds whether they should get rid of Joseph. That they definitely want to do, and they've got the opportunity now since they're so far away from the camp. The question is how to do it. And to my ears, this part of the story, when I reread it recently, sounds clunky. First, they decide they'll kill him. But instead of like cutting his throat or something, they dump him into a well, so he'll have a long, slow death. Then they reconsider and they decide to sell him to that caravan of traders who are going down to Egypt. Then they lie to their father, blaming nature for killing him. Destroy, demote, deny. 3 strategies for betrayal, and it sounds kind of clunky. Why don't they just do one? Wouldn't that make the story flow more smoothly? Well, the story may sound a bit clunky, but that hasn't stopped it from being a roaring success. A few years ago, this church put on a musical retelling the story, starring adults and kids from the Sunday school program. That production was based on the Broadway show, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolour Dreamcoat, which was a big hit in the 80s and 90s. Donny Osmond famously played the part of Joseph when the show came to Toronto. However, I wondered if that story had also been a hit with Lawrence Park before Broadway. So this week, for the first time since the lockdown began, I went back to the church. I wanted to see if there were any old Sunday school books about Joseph and his brothers. If there were, that would mean that this story had been taught to kids over the years. So I searched the library and the Sunday school rooms, and here's what I found. I actually found quite a few books about it. There were about a dozen of them, actually. And the oldest one was this one from 1954. It's called The Bible Story. And just on one of the inside pages, it has a lovely picture of Joseph in his coat. So there he is in his Technicolor coat. Very, very beautiful and bright. And then the next book that I found, the next oldest book, was 1966. And this whole book is devoted to Joseph, the boy who saved his family. And if you open this one up, you will see pictures of Joseph riding on a chariot. There he is. Joseph gets promoted later on in the story, and he becomes the Pharaoh's right-hand man. And so there he is in his chariot. And then, actually, can we see the next picture, Judy, as well? There's another picture of him in the fields with his workers. He's on the right-hand side of the frame, and everybody else is just packing stuff up. So the next book was from 1985. It's this one, another whole book devoted to Joseph and his brothers. And if you turn to the inside page, right there, you get a picture of Joseph with some of the Pharaoh's court members. Now, and then there's another one I found, which was from 2006, this one. And if you look inside this one, you'll see pictures of Joseph. And there's a picture of Joseph talking to the Pharaoh. And there's one thing that's consistent in almost all of these books. And you may have noticed it already. In virtually every single book, the Egyptians are all white people. In book after book, a very white Jesus, a very white Joseph is brought to a very white Egypt. Sometimes the Egyptians look like white people with a bit of a tan, as though they were visiting a Club Med. Pharaoh's court officials, even the slaves in the field, are people with white faces and white bodies. Anyone who's visited modern Egypt knows that this is simply not the case. Egypt is in North Africa, and it looks like it. The people there are a mosaic of the cultures that have made their home in Egypt over the centuries. Black Africans, Arabs, some white people, and people of other races as well. And this reflects the history of Egypt. Egypt was invaded by Muslim Arabs in the 600s. And before that, in around 300 BCE, Alexander the Great brought in his Greek troops. And so in Joseph's era, which was around 1700 BCE, an Egyptian marketplace would have been a sea of brown and black faces reflecting the people of North Africa because those Arabs and those Greeks hadn't arrived yet. Egyptian paintings from this era show people of multiple shades of brown and black, and many statues feature people with large lips and black-looking faces. This is what they thought Egyptians looked like, and yet in our Sunday school books, they look very white. Scholars continue to debate exactly what proportion of Egyptians were black and how many were brown. But what is very clear is that Egypt was never, ever a nation of white people. So if that's so obvious to us now, why do our Sunday school books show white Joseph in white Egypt? Since this is the start of Black History Month, I decided to do some digging to find out. And one thing should be made clear at the very beginning. The Bible has people who hate each other because of their tribes and their religion, but racist discrimination just isn't in there. It never shows up. No one ever says, because of the color of your skin, I hate you. It just is not in the Bible at all. Racism as we know it has not been invented yet. That starts in the 1600s, at the same time as the slave trade begins. When Europeans came to the Americas, they ran out of indigenous people to enslave pretty quickly. So many indigenous people died of disease, and they kept running off, that the European places like Virginia decided we need another labor force. So they started to import Black people from West Africa. Those enslaved Africans were brought to the American South by the millions. And since the American colonies were Christian, they looked for some sort of justification in the Bible for the mass enslavement of Black people. They seized on a small detail at the end of the story of the flood. You may recall Noah has been in the ark for 40 days and 40 nights. The flood recedes, the animals come down, Noah and his family get out of the boat. And then the next thing that happens, and we don't tell this to the children when we talk about the flood story, is that Noah becomes the first person to plant grapes, which are then made into wine, and he has the notorious distinction of being the very first person in the Bible to get drunk. So he gets drunk, he passes out, and I guess he gets drunk naked because he has 3 sons. One of his sons, Ham, walks by, sees him drunk and passed out, and the Bible's a little clear about what happens, but what's clear, very clear, is that he doesn't cover him up. He doesn't do the right thing by covering up his nakedness. Noah's 2 other sons walk by. They see what's happened and they cover him up. When Noah comes to out of his drunken stupor, he finds out what happened and he gets really mad. And he gets mad at Ham, the son who didn't cover him up. And he says, because you didn't cover me up, I'm going to curse your son Canaan. Canaan will be the servant of your other brothers, peoples, and children. This is known as the curse of Ham. Now, a few chapters later in the Bible, there's a genealogy which tells us which nations descend from which ones of these 3 sons. And as it turns out, the Egyptians and the Ethiopians are descended from Ham, the son who didn't cover up Noah. In the 1600s, Christians deduced, well, because there was a curse on one of Noah's sons and some of his descendants become Egyptians and Ethiopians, that means that all Ethiopians and all Egyptians must be people who can be servants of everybody else. And from this, even though there's what you should really understand very, very clearly is that the Bible says that only the people of Canaan would be cursed. And they weren't cursed by God. God didn't curse anybody. Leave God out of this. It was just Noah who was waking up from a bender who says, I curse Ham's son Canaan. So there's no justification in the Bible for cursing the people of Ethiopia or Egypt, just none. But in the 1600s, when there was a lot of money to be made from the slave trade, they decided, oh, well, we can use this as a justification for enslaving people from Africa, because after all, there's sort of an enslavement theme here in the Noah story. They read into it what they wanted to see there, which simply wasn't there. That didn't stop them. So they proclaimed that the Bible said that Black people of Ethiopia and Egypt were cursed to be servants, which meant it was okay to enslave Africans. It was never okay to enslave Africans. God never said that, but Christians, white Christians, deliberately read that into the Bible. Now, you may be wondering, if Christians thought Egyptians were Black, then why do our Sunday school books show them as white? Well, there's one more twist in this story. Napoleon invaded Egypt, and his archaeologists and anthropologists in the early 1800s started to study Egyptian culture. They dug out the Sphinx, which had been covered up in sand, and they were able to decode the hieroglyphs and read the Egyptian language. And what they discovered was that as they studied ancient Egypt, it became clear that Africans had a very sophisticated civilization, which predated European civilization and which had provided all sorts of key ideas in mathematics and engineering and literature and art, all of which were inherited by white Western European civilization. The Egyptians, it became clear, were just as fundamental to Western civilization as the gifts to which we had received from the Greeks and the Romans. But that posed a serious problem. After centuries of enslaving Black Africans and saying that they were inferior human beings, here was proof that brown and Black Africans were actually very sophisticated. It was like doing a family tree and finding out that some of your ancestors for your white family were Black people, and they were highly accomplished Black people. This was embarrassing to white Americans in the 1800s and white Europeans. And if it were to be let stand, it would undermine the entire rationale for slavery. So, respected white scholars at universities all over Europe and the United States introduced a new theory. They argued that Egypt had been founded by white people, Caucasians who had come from the north and the east and had settled along the Nile Valley. White people were the ones who had been in charge and built the pyramids and done all of those wonderful things which Egyptian civilization had created. Egyptians, they declared, were never Black. They were white people with a tan. They had never been Black people at all. Biblical scholars joined in and declared that, in fact, Black people had never played any role in the Bible. The Bible was the story of God's relationship with white people, and that included Egyptians and Jews alike. That idea became so entrenched that over 100 years later, Donny Osmond and David Cassidy could play the Jewish Joseph among very, very white-looking Egyptians. That idea became so popular that in Sunday schools and books in churches all over North America, they could depict a white Joseph going to a white Egypt as a slave, where he met all sorts of white Egyptians. In fact, he didn't meet any Egyptians who didn't look like Joseph, who was depicted as white. In this reading, the Bible is the story of God talking to white people. And that's what we allowed to be shown to our children in Sunday school for decades and decades and decades. And adults didn't catch on because when they went into churches, they saw white people in the stained glass for every single Bible story. Earlier, I said that the beginning of the Joseph story sounded clunky. The brothers can't seem to make up their minds how they should betray Joseph. Are they going to throw him in a well to destroy him? Or are they going to sell him into slavery to demote him? Or are they going to deny him to his father by pretending he's dead and blame nature for his disappearance? It sounds messy. But perhaps what the Bible is trying to do here is to show us the strategies that people use to betray each other. First, try to destroy them. Throw them in the well, leave them for dead. If that doesn't work, make them seem less human by demoting them, selling them into slavery, claiming that they're inferior. And the last step is to deny that they even exist. Destroy, demote, deny. That strategy fits very well with how whites treated blacks during the slavery era. They demoted them through enslavement. They killed them for even the slightest hint of disobedience, and millions died in the transit from Africa to America on those horribly crowded slave ships. And finally, scholars decided to deny that they'd ever been civilized and that they'd ever played any part in the Bible. Destroy, demote, deny. And the Joseph story lays it all out, so we can see it as a kind of user's manual for evil, for how people get robbed of their humanity. Showing us that formula is an act of grace, so that we can see the signs of when a people are being betrayed and denied their humanity. It gives us insight into what happened during the slave trade, and it can also give us some insight over what's happened this past year during the pandemic. Back in March, when the pandemic began, as we all know, the first outbreaks occurred in long-term care homes. The mortality rates were tragically high, so we as a society decided to mobilize to save lives of our elderly by going into lockdown. Ever since then, the pandemic has seemed like a kind of gray plague that affects elderly people the most, and then everybody else. But among Black people in Canada, the pandemic has looked very different. In Toronto and Montreal, the majority of staff at long-term care homes are people of color, and often Black. In fact, 1/3 of all Black women who are in the workforce work in healthcare. So to these women, the outbreaks at the long-term care homes weren't just about old people getting sick, but about people of color getting sick and infected too. In Montreal, the first major outbreaks in the community were in the Black neighborhoods where the long-term care home workers lived. So Black rights advocates started asking, how many of us are sick with this thing? How many Black people have died? And they asked questions of cities and provinces and the federal government, and the answer at all 3 levels of government was the same. We don't know. We don't collect that kind of data. We don't need to, because this isn't a racist society. The Joseph story tells us that betrayal takes the form of destruction, demotion, and denial. Canada's governments denied that race was part of the COVID-19 crisis, suggesting instead that the major risk factor was just being very old. But as the months passed, outbreaks started appearing in crowded factories, warehouses, and meatpacking plants. These are industries that are staffed primarily by racialized people. By the summer, Toronto finally agreed to start collecting statistics based on race, not just age. And the results were shocking. By November 30th, the city had discovered that 79% of all COVID-19 infections outside of long-term care homes are among racialized people. 79%. The group at greatest risk, Blacks, despite being just 9% of the population, make up 26% of all of the COVID-19 infections in Toronto outside of long-term care homes. 26%, 1/4. And yet, even knowing this, for months, everyday statistics about the pandemic focus on the impact of the elderly, making it seem as though all of the rest of us are equally at risk. Today, it's known that in the US and the UK, and places like Toronto, Black people are much more likely to contract COVID-19 than white people. This has nothing to do with their biology, like their race or anything. Race is a socially constructed concept. Many Blacks instead are stuck in low-wage work where outbreaks are frequent. They are our essential workers. Every day you can see on the internet which long-term care homes have major outbreaks, and you can even track them by name. But the government has been vague about which workplaces are having outbreaks, even though there can be 300 people in a workplace and 300 people in a long-term care home. We'll hear about the long-term care home outbreak, but we won't find out which company has an outbreak at their meatpacking plant or their warehouse. So we're being vague about when outbreaks happen to people of color, but we're being very specific about it when it turns out to be elderly people. And to this day, no one knows what the death rate from COVID-19 is for Black people in Canada or Toronto or Ontario. We don't collect or release that kind of data. We know the death rate for people for every age, from 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40. We know all of that, but we can't break it down for the people who are actually most at risk. In the US and the UK, however, they do collect this data. And they've found that Blacks are 3 to 4 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than whites are. 3 to 4 times more likely. How many Blacks have died here? We don't know. As if it didn't matter. Destroy, demote, deny. That's how people are betrayed, and that's what's happening right now. Right here. In the Joseph story, the brothers who betray him do not win. As we'll see in the weeks ahead, Joseph suffers many setbacks and mishaps when he goes to Egypt, but eventually he escapes captivity and becomes one of the most powerful people in the country. His biggest challenge is what to do with his brothers. But the story is clear. Just because his brothers gave up on him, God never did. In the Sunday school books that I found to tell his story, there were a few that showed Joseph in an Egypt populated by Black and brown people. This one is from 2003. You know, it took decades for Black scholars who started in the 1960s to say, wait a second, Egypt's not white, for the message to sink in and finally get into our Sunday school books. The stories looked better, as though God cares about lots of different kinds of people, not just one kind. The Joseph story is the same in these books, but it means more because if a Black or brown child sits down to read them, they can see themselves in the story. People whose ancestors created a great civilization. That's something that kids from all backgrounds should know. It took a long time for us to color in the lines of the Joseph story, but it happened, and it's worth it, and it's better. Here in Toronto, just this week, the city announced that it had set up a commission of people from the Black community to study how COVID-19 has been hitting Black people in Toronto. There will be mobile teams to bring vaccines into Black communities where people actually live. and also to help test them there. This is happening because Black people protested and lobbied to get the government to listen to them. But there's still major problems. Racialized workers need better protections at work to prevent outbreaks in the first place. And Queen's Park needs desperately to pass legislation for paid work leave so that if someone does feel ill at home, they don't go into work because they can't afford not to. The refusal to make that pass that kind of legislation is basically saying, we know that most of you are Black and racialized people in Toronto who are getting this, but we don't care. We don't mind that you get sick because us white people at home, we can work from home, we're okay, but you shouldn't be given the same option to stay home if you get sick. We need to pass that legislation. It's the only fair thing to do for the people who are really being infected in the community by this pandemic. We need to take seriously the idea that we are all one family. We're all brothers and sisters. And not one of us should ever be betrayed by the others as less than anyone else. God made us all. It's time for us to color in our society, to see the full story of who we are and who we can be. Amen.